Over to you, Ross.
I'll invite you to do like a formal over to you, so that actually it is over to me. I'm just quite excited. Yeah. Cool. Hey, thank you for joining, everyone. We've got a nice cozy number today, so we've got 16 participants today. We've got a slightly different format because actually ends are not something that the charity sector does traditionally well, and I don't think it comes from a particularly bad place, and we'll maybe talk a wee bit about that as we go through today. So we actually really struggled to find organisations who do endings well within the third sector, and actually for me that's an interesting part of this discussion that some will be exploring. I'm going to put the link to Joe's book in the chat as well. If you've not seen the book, so it's called Ends, Why We Overlook Endings for Humans, Products, Services and Digital, and Why We Shouldn't. And Joe has been working in this space for a number of years, for 15 years, thinking about appropriate endings and closure experiences for services, both in digital and face-to-face. So we're really excited about this one. It's, as I said, for me, it's one of those just overlooked areas of the services that we provide. And it's going to be really interesting to explore what that looks like in your own services today and how we can do this stuff better and what that might look like. Just say as well, as John said, if you can put your camera on, that'd be quite nice and we can see you. If you're ashamed of like the washing that's hanging in the background, don't worry. I had a guy on a Zoom call once who was in his wife's dressing gown and didn't realise. And then I started chatting to him, and then you could see the shock in his face, and then he turned his camera off. So none of you are in your wife's dressing gown. You can be if you want. There'll be no judgment on this call if you are. That's totally fine. Also, say hello to Martin Keane, who's joining us from the dark side of the private sector today, but used to work in the charity sector for the charity One Kind. So there you go.
Hey guys.
Sure Martin will have some thoughts on this. Martin works in ed tech, so I'm sure he will have lots of thoughts on endings and what that looks like in this space, and we chat later on. Cool, right. 3 people without their videos, but it's totally okay if you're in your dressing gown. That is fine. Right, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to hand over to Joe. Joe's in Stockholm as well. That's exciting. I think you might be our furthest away. No, you're not our furthest away speaker. We had someone in Australia, didn't we?
Yeah.
We made that up. Yeah, we had someone in Australia. Sorry, I built that up, Joe, and then I just crushed you immediately. But Stockholm's still quite far.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, thanks a lot. I'm going to try and open up the sharing thing and go to that, and then go to Acrobat and go full screen. So you should be seeing Ends full screen now. Yeah?
That's fine, yeah.
Good. And now it should be going in a minute. So if it doesn't start moving along, then please shout. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about endings and creating consumer offboarding experiences. I'm going to deep dive into digital aspects of that because I think there's lots in the background which can be really helpful to think about when you're building, taking especially the charity stuff into sort of into digital services. It's quite short, this presentation, but there's loads of other stuff all around endings which I've talked about in the past on other things and in the books. But we can have a chat about that later. Right, so let's start. We're all going to die. Historically, we were a lot more comfortable with that. But over generations, we've been distancing ourselves from witnessing and discussing the end of our lives. We've mimicked this distancing in our consumer experiences, failing to design an ending to the consumer life cycle. Without an end, problems with consumerism fall to the feet of society, lingering there, breaking up environments, whether they be physical, digital, or service type environments. Now, I've been working in product development for 20 odd years, and in that time, I've been in big companies, small companies, creating products all over the world. And I would observe a similar pattern when I would start a project with, irregard across all of that landscape, whoever it was. We would get really excited about the story we were going to tell the consumer. We would get very passionate about onboarding that consumer, making a really good product which has been thought through on many different levels. But we never talked about the end. We failed to design that whole third of the consumer offboarding, the consumer experience. But there is a person who does deal with that, and that is the consumer as they move from usage to the end. They're ridiculed, threatened, exposed, criticized and blamed. But let me give you an example of what I mean by an ending. With printer ink cartridges. My printer seems to run out of ink every few minutes, it seems. So I go out, I buy a new printer ink cartridge, I come home, take the old one out, put the new one in. I'm standing there holding an old printer ink cartridge, which is super toxic and really shouldn't go in landfill. And I'm standing there thinking, what shall I do with this? I can't throw it in the bin. So I look on the back of the packaging. There's 2 other marketing messages on there. I still don't know what to do. But like any normal human being, I go online, I find out actually this company's been doing a really good recycling and reclaiming program for 20 years, but I don't know about it in the context of my experience as a consumer. But I do find out if I fill in some loads of details about my personal life and like where I live, how old I am, and agree to terms and conditions, they'll send me an envelope. And they send me an envelope, takes a couple of days to get to me. And I put the printer ink cartridge in the envelope, take it up to the post office, then it probably takes another couple of days to get back to them. It's taken 5 days to offboard this consumer experience. It was hidden from me, the consumer. It was totally broken apart from the offboarding experience. And this is going on everywhere in digital services and physical product experiences. But I assumed this was the result of some sort of hard-nosed business logic when I started looking into this issue. But as I dug deeper and deeper into it, it became clear to me that we're framing this in far too short a time period. We need to look back centuries. So imagine yourself in the 14th century. Your life's pretty grim. You are very impoverished. There's lots of disease around. In fact, you have a very comfortable relationship with this subject, death. You see death as a normal part of life. And your life is so difficult that you're desperate to try and get to this place, heaven. Now, heaven has a similar offering to many religions. It's warm, it's abundant, and people are generally nice there. So you desperately want to get to here. And to get there, you need to follow certain rules. One of which was certain things around funerals and how you might offboard life. But this all changes in Europe, in Northern Europe, around the time of the plague. The plague arrives in 1347. It decimates Europe, and it kills a third of Europe's population within 3 years. This changes everyone's relationship with all sorts of things, and particularly death. Death becomes a very meaningless experience and questionable experience. What's going to happen to my body, for example? The dominant religion at the time was the Catholic religion. They very much mismanaged it. A lot of their service personnel, i.e. their priests, were dying because they were so exposed to the plague. And they were also giving out these things called indulgences, which are sort of get out of jail free card for rich people. New challenger religions came along, one of which was the Protestants with Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther and the Protestants had some different ideas of how we should live our lives in sort of Northern Europe at the time, which was also the source of the Industrial Revolution. So they had some beliefs around fasting, for example. Now, Martin Luther removed fasting from the Protestant calendar very early on. Many religions have a period in the religious calendar which have a point where we reflect on the abundance of life and we withdraw from that and start thinking about how lucky we are. And that process of fasting is a lot of thanks in there. But in the Protestant religion, that was removed. We also changed our relationship with jobs. In the Catholic religion at the time, there was 3 good jobs, a pope, a priest, and a nun. All other jobs were considered pretty rubbish. And but then with the Protestants, Martin Luther believed any job done well in the eyes of God is a good job. And it's the beginning of career paths. Many people think it's about education. Actually, so much is about the Protestants, about your job in your career. And lastly, investment in the eyes of God was started to have a softening idea in the Protestants, so you can start investing. And these 3 things start to lay the foundation to the Industrial Revolution to really get energized. But let's look at this period through a different lens. So through the consumer perspective, and particularly around waste and getting rid of waste. So the waste from the kitchen table would go to the animals. The waste from the animals would go onto the land, and the abundance and harvest from the land would come back to the kitchen table. This relationship with waste was visible, it was understandable, and it was actionable to pre-industrial times, the consumer of pre-industrial times, a circle of consumption. We changed that into a linear narrative, and over centuries, we've been splitting that beginning from end. So at the beginning of the consumer life cycle, we've been accelerating consumption. We've been creating department stores. We've been persuading ourselves with these amazing stories through advertising. We've been creating cultural norms like progressive obsolescence, which allows us to keep buying stuff regardless of things running out. And the offboarding, though, we've changed our relationship there. We've distanced it. We've made it more scientific. We've removed our responsibility to that. And you can see that in our relationship with sort of scientific things like germs and the atom bomb, nuclear waste, and then more recently, carbon and climate change and that type of waste, carbon waste. It's distant, it's invisible, only scientists can see it. It's the realm of scientists. It's nothing to do with me, the individual consumer. We've also created things like the Dixie cup, which was the first disposable cup, which allows us to instantly forget about something at the offboarding experience. And this has created a psychosis in all of us, where one side of me loves buying stuff. I have this incredibly sophisticated vocabulary around what to buy, how to buy it, and what it makes me feel like. And at the offboarding, I have a very muted language. I criticize things about consumerism, yet I do not have an opportunity to see myself in that that same consumer experience. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about some work I've been doing with Anna and Marcus. Marcus is actually on the call today, so we might have some thoughts from him later. This work is about what it means in the digital sense, in the data sense. So I thought this might be interesting to this audience. So the internet doesn't like data endings. Ever since its idea and its creation as a part of a military research project in the 70s called the Interneting Project, at its source, it's been about removing the risk of data deletion. And we've carried on that theme. We are failing to conceive endings in data. So this goes from a consumer relationships, we fail to see it in businesses, and we fail to see it in the technology that they rely on. So let's look at the consumer case. We've changed a lot in our consumer relationships, especially around Cambridge Analytica. Trust and tolerance of the internet has dropped significantly, and it continues to drop, especially after sort of like last year's US election as well. We also, in fact, I experienced this a lot on Twitter. People say to me on Twitter, they call me out and they say, why is it so hard to leave? And then they insert loads of different companies. And then I hear product owners say, if customers can leave easily, then we should make it harder for them to leave. Otherwise, loads of them will leave. And it's just not true. Let's look at this, though, from the sort of relationship model that the consumer is experiencing. So if we think about this one on my left, which is the walled trusted garden, this is a really simple relationship for the consumer to understand. I have a relationship with a company. This will probably be a high security one, like a tax or government or banking relationship. I've given them my identity, and they have created a very strong, clear, single engagement there. I also then can move up that grade, so a systematic sort of visible relationship. So I sign up to a company, they send me emails. I believe it's just this one-way passage in that one. That's quite simple for me to understand as a consumer. We go up one level from that to a sort of proxy OAuth. And this is when you sign up for a service with your Facebook account or your Google account. And you get that type of experience. And you're sort of seeing this as a proxy relationship. But the one which is growing the most and which is totally out of control, and the visibility of that for the consumer is almost impossible to grapple is this asymmetric invisible relationship, which is my perception as a consumer is one-dimensional. The reality is there's multiple dimensions to this through third parties, advertising, et cetera, and this one isn't talked about or understood enough at all by the consumer. And one method to think about this through in a sequence as the consumer starts experiencing stuff is through the sort of life cycle of the consumer service. So at sign up, that consumer has an ability to sort of put in their own data and start feeling like they have control of that data. They start to add in their address, telephone number, etc. And in usage, we as consumers can dig into the settings of a service and then manipulate those things. So I change my email address or my profile picture, etc. But in the aftermath, a lot of that data gets left there. I have no access as a consumer into the settings. I have no access into like how my relationship with deeper data is going. And there's no identity attached to that old relationship either, but data's still being processed afterwards. Let's look at the business case now. So Gartner predict like by 2025, which isn't very long away, 80% of marketers who invested in personalization will abandon their efforts. Many of those personalization things are about building up identity profiles. 27% of marketers believe data is the key obstacle to personalization. I think that's fascinating. That shows how clumsy everything is behind the scenes. And also we're seeing legislation increased across geographies all around the world. Apparently the South African one is pretty good at the moment. Don't know if anyone's dug into that, but we've experienced GDPR this year. I'm sure many of you are sick of that. But this is some of the examples around businesses, and you might, especially if you've worked in big companies, especially old companies like British Telecom's a good example, been around for decades, and every nation has a type of British Telecom. They've got promotions that they were doing maybe a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago that they can't remove people from because they've got such an embedded billing components, etc. So loads of these are very complicated to move. So the businesses just don't end stuff. And also we see this in terms of it's a version of this sort of data hoarding that we're starting to see a lot more of in businesses. And if we think about the technical case of data as well, so the data lifecycle is far longer than a lot of the time the consumer perceives it is, thinking like you've just shut down your data relationship. Often it's still lingering in the background for some time. And until it's been properly purged, which isn't really in the vocabulary of many consumers. The data argument has been on this trip of big data for almost a decade now. People have been banging on about big data, and this has created an enormous sense of vulnerabilities and just like, let's just consume. And companies have relinquished this into a sort of instead of interrogating and ordering it, have put it into these sort of massive data lakes, which merge all sorts of servers in together. But they're super hard to interrogate those things. One example of this is a big international bank. I think this is Marcus's example, so you can chat to him later about it. The biggest international bank process trillions of dollars a day, want to sort of try and get some insight into that. They create this massive data lake and trying to sort of interrogate that data lake, massive failure. And the project was mothballed at great expense and all the people on it were fired. And this is just one example of this big data hubris coming into the data world. But also you see it with other companies as well, like in other versions. Stripe keep releasing APIs, but each one of them isn't really updating the old one. So you end up getting these multiple levels of APIs, which get super complex, and they don't maintain the old APIs. So that becomes also complicated in the back end. And on a philosophical level, we're seeing the data science, which has a clear ending. So when you're doing good data science, it's about building up a process, working out the hypothesis of that, and then test, refine, test, refine. You write that test and then you refactor afterwards. And it's very clear about that ending and what happens in the end. But instead of this sort of big data hubris we're getting, the data swamp, which everyone's talking about, that's just a matter of storage, resourcing forever, and it becomes very infinite. Anything which has like infinite on it is bad, in my opinion, as you'd imagine. And this also creates problems for humans across all sorts of digital experiences. So facial recognition ends up giving biases and false positives for people of color and women. And sentencing software in the US also has these type of embedded sort of racism, as it were. And you're also getting this experiencing in banks, where big banks are biased in particular things around this old data and making it very difficult for women borrowers. Okay, so this in essence has created on the surface of everything these problems with endings in the consumer sense. Consumers feel like they can't end a relationship very clearly. In a business sense, we feel like businesses just can't face an ending and the complexity of that ending, just almost throughout a cultural relationship with endings in businesses. And in a technical sense, we're failing to end things and just hoarding all of this nonsense in the background and can't manage that. One thing which we find it quite interesting in our discussions is the solid pods, so I don't know how many of you have heard of solid pods. This is a proposal by Tim Berners-Lee. So what happens at the moment when we have a data relationship as a consumer is that the businesses own all of that data and they own our identity to that data. So we, as a consumer, dig into their servers. So this is sort of flipping that model. So the proposal is the data, the solid pod would be this type of technical secure element that a consumer owns. And then the business is allowed to interrogate into that data. Now, this has loads of benefits to the consumer in terms of control, but there's actually stacks around what are beneficial to businesses. So in a consumer sense, this increases the sort of visibility and our control and allows you to have a proper clear ending, and you know it's an ending. In a business sense, actually, lots of businesses you'd imagine being repulsed by such a thing, but actually, because the compliance stuff and managing costs, there's loads of benefits in the financial sense to moving your data off site into the solid pods. And in the technical sense, the focus on product benefits and this freedom to refactor quickly and get very up-to-date information is quite desirable in the technical sense. So lastly, I want to end on this, I find fascinating philosophical quandary in cookies. So everyone talks about cookies and they dig into your things, but what you really want to look at to have quite a laugh online is cookie consent endings. So cookies are a little tiny bit of data that comes onto your computer after you visit a website or when you visit a website. Now, there's two types of cookies. There's a persistent cookie, which stays on your computer and sends back information to the server. And there's a session cookie, which is just for that one session you're on that website with. Now, the situation is that people create persistent cookies and that are doing that type of sending back information for a lot longer than they should. The directive, the recommended amount of time a persistent cookie should last is 12 months. So let's think about that as we progress into here. So I like to go onto a digital website and look into its cookies, but I'm also particularly interested, because of endings, into the expiry date of these cookies. So this one you can see here, it says at the bottom, this expires after 3 months. Well, that seems pretty reasonable, I think. So this is just off one website. I collated many of the cookies and found the ones which lasted the longest. So as you can see here, Amazon, the third one down, that lasts for 5,758 days, which seems like a crazy amount of time. 15 years. I've never had a computer that lasts 15 years. And my behavior must change a lot over 15 years. So that's pretty weird. And you'll see the big sort of tech giants, Google, Amazon, and the others, like they cluster around the sort of 10 to 20 year mark. Then you get into the one generation, one lifetime ones, which is like Acuity, 68 years. And then you get into multiple generational lifetime cookie consent, which is like 100 years. So that's 36,000 days, as you can see. And then you get into crazy land. So we're into like Home Depot wants me to approve a cookie which lasts 1,642 years. So putting that in perspective, if I was a person in Rome, in the Roman Empire, before the sacking of Rome, and I approved a cookie, that would be expiring right now. And then lastly, there's digital trends themselves. They've got a cookie in there, which is 2,914,550 days, 7,979 years. If I approve that now, it wouldn't expire to the year 10,000. That's the end. That's the book. And that's me stopping sharing. Okay, so I hope you got a lot out of that. I know it wasn't particularly on the charity sector, but I thought it might be quite interesting. As it's called DigiShift, I thought it was a bit more digital. Maybe I should have targeted it a bit more on the services side, but hopefully that was interesting to you.
That's brilliant, Joe. Thank you so much. Just a wee round of applause for Joe as well. That's so good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Yeah. And we've put a couple of links to Joe's website and the book in the chat. We're going to open it up for questions, and then we'll have a wee discussion. So has anyone got any questions for Joe?
I'm going to jump in with a quick one to start with, just to get the ball rolling. I was really interested, Joe. That was such a kind of a much deeper talk than I expected to be. And I know that you take quite a philosophical approach, but it was really, really interesting. And I think I was interested in the kind of distinction between like natural endings, like sort of decomposition and natural cycle you have in the beginning, and then obsolescence, which is actually kind of problematic because stuff just stops working too early. And I wondered if you could talk about that a bit. I think the cookie example is a great one of showing, what a ludicrous statement to think something would be needed for 7,000 years. But, what's a good middle ground?
I think the middle ground is basically following what the consumer wants. So one of the benefits of solid stuff, the solid pod example, is that the consumer would decide when the cookie consent ends, which I think is much better. And you can see that across other services and digital and products. So to give you a sense of, let's look at some of those things around the natural sort of ending. I think should be led by the consumer. So you should make good endings irregard of how long it lasts, how short it is. If the consumer leaves with a bad ending, and I know a big music streaming service, for example, they had that perception that if it's easy to leave, then more people will leave. And actually, there was an argument in that company about that, and they decided to implement a good ending. And what they found out of a good ending and a smooth ending, that people had a far more appetite to give really coherent, beneficial feedback at offboarding. Instead of what usually happened, they'd be so frustrated by the end of trying to get out and leave. They would be really angry and they wouldn't give any coherent feedback. So what they got out of that after a period of time of that happening was that they got such a lot of way more valuable, insightful data about the wider service that they never would have got if they had a bad ending. So it's not about just thinking of the binary, they're a consumer and they're not a consumer. It's a matter of like, I'm a very knowledgeable consumer and I have to leave now. That's a stack of data in that experience there. And what we're seeing, I think you talked about obsolescence. I worked at Nokia for years, and in that time, I never heard anyone talk about a planned obsolescence of their products. And people might think I'm crazy, but it's not really on the agenda. Everyone is so focused on more sales and good products, more sales and good products. It's not a matter that it's designed to fail at the end. For many companies, I know it still goes on, but it's just not thought about. And the problem with that is that we create so much rubbish in the world that we haven't got an ability, even an ability to philosophize about what we're going to do with it. We just create more rubbish in the world. And you can see this with e-waste. So we see many of our high-end businesses, especially in the West, like car companies or high-end computer or et cetera company, moving from product delivery, single engagement, I'm going to sell you something, to service delivery. So sign up with us and you'll always have a good computer, car, etc., etc. That is such a Western rich perspective of the world. You just go a few levels down from that perception, we're into horrifying amounts of e-waste. And you could probably see that in your cupboards of all of the rubbish Bluetooth speakers we've bought over the last 10 years, is that we are hopelessly out of control in terms of handling all of our things that we buy. So those are two perspectives. I hope I've answered your question in some of that, John.
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of questions that just popped into chat. So I wonder if, Rory, you want to talk about the community empowerment angle that you brought up?
Yeah, hi Joe, and hi everyone else. I am very new in role, so endings are have been in the forefront of my brain for the last wee while. I work in a kind of the community engagement and community empowerment sphere, where you are encouraged to be doing yourself out of a job. You are empowering people to take action and to be their own actors in their lives, and then you're withdrawing. But what I found very evident in having left the job and just started a new one, that I hadn't thought about the end in those terms. So I was curious to hear maybe about some of your perspective around building endings into service design and project design.
So when you leave a job, I think we're hopelessly old school in terms of our jobs and I think a cultural perception of jobs. We're still in the belief that we're going to have a job and we start a job and we just keep on with it for an infinite amount of time. And in that period of time, when you start a job and you get into that job, then you don't really put your head up and really look, what was my plan? I just carry on in that job forever. And this is starting to change the discussion around that. I think there's a guy called Reid Hoffman that started LinkedIn, and he talks about how people should look at their career in terms of objectives and tasks instead of jobs. So you should only get a job to do a particular thing and achieve a particular thing in that job. And in that time, you should be able to get in there and do that, and then you leave. And you shouldn't get into a job just to have a job. He also says something along the lines, I'll probably get the phrasing of it wrong, but acknowledging that people leave a job is the way you have a conversation and plan for the best people to stay at that job. And it's a matter of like talking about that stuff up front. Now, there was another part to your question, was there? Did that answer some of it?
Yeah, it was about how to build the endings into service design. So if we think, for example, about the investment in community projects through lockdown, some people maybe haven't planned an end for that as lockdown finishes. So how do you build endings into service design?
I think so. One of the reasons I'm doing the next book is to provide tools for people to work on that themselves. So I'm not going to be able to come on here and think about your business in the absolute and go, oh, you know what you need is X. But what I have done in the book, and you can see some of this on the website, which is andend.co, is provide tools so you can get into it and start digging around in it yourself. So the first big step is acknowledging that people are going to leave and then getting everyone on board. So in the workshops that I do, I talk to, I have the first exercise that everyone does is work out where the end is of a particular product, service or digital product. And you never hear this conversation go on in work. So you will hear loads of conversations about sales. So there'll be a sales meeting, I guarantee, at any business every week. There'll be loads of people working on the product, and they'll all be talking about quality and people doing things and how they're doing it and whether they're doing it with a success rate. All of the people at that company will leave, or all the customers at that business will leave, and no one has probably ever had once a year or ever an ends meeting to see, so where is the end of our consumer experience? And it's a really interesting thing to listen to, because you'll hear people, when I do the workshops, not so much now because I don't hear the conversations online, but when I was doing in the things, people always say, especially people who are a bit more salesy, they go, yeah, but then they end, but then there's a new sale and then they come back in this way. And they're always like, and that's, you've got to really sort of try to avoid that, people pushing into like at the end, and then there's a new sale. And this is a real problem. So once people get into that, then you can start to understand this. For me, I've encountered, or I plan and observe 8 types of different endings that we have commonly as consumers. And we talk about the competitive one all the time, and none of the other ones are ever talked about. So you just get this endless discussion about competitive endings. And that's when somebody leaves for another product. And it's not always the case. So there's lots of tools out there, which stacks of them are on the website, and you can look into that. So
yeah, I'm just going to cut in with another quick one here, which is a nice little pragmatic one from Jack in chat. He's talked about the cookie pop-ups, and I guess that's interesting because at one level, great that they're asking, but at another level, how annoying that they keep asking the same question again and again. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Jack?
If I can find my unmute button.
Yeah.
No, I think I've put everything, all my feelings into that. But it does, one of the beauties about the internet and using web browsing is that you can get information quickly, but when you're being prevented from getting to that information because you have to approve lots of questions first, it's just so frustrating that I actually then go to look for an alternative source of that information.
Yeah. I think this is really interesting because it's so similar to the way we've been sold digital films. So if you think that we've always experienced an ownership model for like hundreds of years before the internet, digital stuff. So I would go and buy a film and then I'll take it home and watch it, and it'll be on the shelf. And so when Apple comes along, or any other company which is doing digital films, they took that metaphor of ownership and then they put it onto their system. So I believed when I buy a film on Apple, although it's still on Apple, it's mine, I own it and no one can take it away from me, which isn't actually the case. And now they're scrambling, Apple and others, to try and get to a point where we're having that similar experience to ownership, but they're giving this, trying to wrap us up in this sort of subscription model, which gives them a lot more control. And the reason why I believe that's similar to what we're experiencing online is that we've been given loads of this stuff online, and culturally, I believe I should be able to go onto all these websites. We were paying off that, we were taking that purchase in the background through data, as many of you will know. And so now what we're doing, I think, when we are looking into cookies and we're becoming more aware is just how much we were paying for this access. And I find digging into this thing, going onto a website, looking into the cookies and doing similar things to what you were doing, Jack, is to take it all away, that then they don't give me access. I realize how much it costs me in terms of data and therefore sort of a currency, as it were. So I think it's more that we're all moving towards a normality of actually what was going on in the first place, similar to ownership of films.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. That was really useful. Can I ask a question just for people in the room? Has anyone taken deliberate steps to design endings in the services, digital or otherwise, that they create? Can anyone share any experiences around that? And it could be like literally like some kind of micro interaction. It doesn't need to be something big.
I'll just check, see if anyone's got one. One funny thing I was involved in with an environmental group I used to work with was we were doing a very big campaign that felt very difficult to actually win. But one of our teams said, this probably will work, so we need to have a strategy for what we talk about when we're finished. Because so many people have been invested for so many years to kind of push this change to happen. There was a need to kind of say, well, we actually have done it. Because I think people, particularly in the kind of advocacy sphere, one thing that drives them forwards is this feeling that things are not good enough, we need to push harder. And so there's a real tendency to say, right, well, we got to this stage, but we need to keep going even further. And that's, a huge driver for change. But there needed to be that moment where everybody got together and said, you know what, things do need fixing in other areas, but we want to step back and celebrate that we have done something quite powerful. It's kind of interesting that I think we hadn't done that, then the big moment might sort of sail past a bit and people are going, well, what happened? So it's kind of important to say, be ready to celebrate something big when it happens. It's kind of interesting.
I think that's really, really, really true. And when I've worked at big companies before and you do a project and then it actually gets released in like a year or so, nobody remembers. There's not much closure to it. And I think humans really enjoy getting closure experiences. Another thing on lockdown, I think, which those sort of little wins that you might have at work, which was sort of used to be celebrated, maybe with some sort of coffee or drinks or something, they're not happening anymore. And I think it is a sort of chips away at this loneliness that we're all experiencing without having ad hoc little celebrations, little moments of reflection and closure around things. And I think particularly in charity stuff, and I think when I look at environmental stuff, is that we do have wins occasionally and they're not celebrated, and we don't, and I think having a good win and bringing yourself together around that and having that closure around it also empowers you for the future as well. And I think you're totally right, John, about that the importance of that. And that is a very human bonding experience. So all big transitions in life, going from single to being married, I don't know, leaving college and university, these are big social groupings. They're not, you know, they're often a component of it.
I'm going to jump in, if that's okay, because I'm actually really desperate to hear your answer to Siarnay's question around, Siarnay said she'd be interested to hear and to know how the process of researching and writing your book, how that's actually impacted on your own online behaviour and interactions.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a big one. So I didn't really want to write a book when the first book. So I started digging into the issue of endings. And I think you'll hear this a lot from different authors, if anyone's written a book. It wasn't a matter of I wanted to write a book because I've got that sort of those choices in life. It was a matter I had to write a book. Like, I'm really dyslexic, so it really wasn't a thing that I wanted to do. So I started digging into this story and finding this stuff out, and found, oh my God, this is so interesting. I have to tell people. And I thought, oh, I'll write a Medium article and do a conference or something. And then I wrote one chapter, then another and another, you know, and before I knew it, I had 4 chapters down. And then I thought, oh, well, wait a minute, I need to understand what is because you need a narrative arc in the book, obviously, even a non-fiction one. So I needed to have some starting chapters and some ending chapters. So have some more conclusive stuff and some establishment, background, historical stuff. And so I went down those processes. Coming from digital and doing print in my early years, coming back to the relationship thing. So I'd done print years ago, and there's nothing like print to give you a final ending. You know, especially if you're doing a print job I'm sure many of you do print and marketing campaigns with flyers. Getting a print job wrong isn't like getting a website wrong. So when I go into the digital world, and I come from this world of really messing up some really expensive projects instantly, come into digital and like, oh yeah, we just make that correction, upload a new site, up a new version. So there's loads of that. And then when you have a book, you wrote a book, and it was inside you, you've managed to get it out into text, and then you've managed to get it out into a book form, and then you got it into the wider world. And that is super worrying, because you've put it out in the world and now you're going to get the reaction. And there's a big moment of reflection there as well. So those are some of the things, high points, low points, insights I've had. I don't know if those are answered. Whose question was it?
Siarnay.
Yeah, I thought, thanks, Joe. That was really good. Jeff's probably got a nice follow-up there actually about, Jeff, maybe you want to actually jump on and ask it yourself, but that evidence about people not putting in the time to leave things even when they're paying for the service. Do you know, on a really boring note actually, right? So I saw someone tweet about like trying to leave a magazine subscription is the most difficult thing you'll ever do in your life. And having experienced that, I can definitely agree. And it's like where we've deliberately built in those types of endings. So Jeff, I don't know, if you want to give any context to that question.
Yeah, I guess what we're sort of saying is some of the technology is making it more straightforward. So the appearance of the unsubscribe button a couple of years ago has been transformative for my inbox. But it's still probably only about 60% of things. My magazine experience has actually been quite different in that I left When Saturday Comes and Rouleur, and both of them just sent me a nice note, and it was like one email and it was done. And they took action, even when I only inquired about how to leave. So they were both quite good. But I guess it's this reality of the challenge that many organizations out there are continuing to spam people and make money because people just don't make so there's there's the consumer demand for endings maybe smaller than than we might think it should be.
Yeah, I hear people talk about this unsubscribe thing, and it's a legal requirement. So it's sort of like the only endings we often do are sort of the legal ones. And you see this with GDPR has introduced loads of different endings that we are experiencing. Arguably, the cookie stuff is the result of more legislation. And so what we end up doing is reacting to legislation. And this makes a lot of the endings very incoherent to the rest of the consumer experience. So over here, you'll have very coherent, very educated, very sophisticated brand messages, usage experiences have been really honed to absolutely everything. And then over here, you get legislation, and the business itself hasn't got a whole strategy for endings. Instead, it just reacts to micro sort of elements of legislation. So when I talk to businesses, I say, you might do legal basics even very well, but you haven't got an ending strategy. Endings will have ability to be framed throughout the consumer lifecycle, and you need to also think about what that experience is as they offboard at different stages, at the moment of ending, and what's the aftermath experience. So businesses tend to be on the back foot around every aspect of ending because they're all only looking at legislation. They need to get strategic with endings and think about what's the whole landscape of our endings going to be like, and how do we empower the consumer to have the best possible ending so they take our reputation with us, and then they'll celebrate us and they'll come back again when they choose to engage again. And I think that's a very different thing to like bare legislation best practice. Hopefully that's answered your question,
Yeah,
Jeff.
that was really useful. I've got just, I guess something more as a thought for people, and if you feel up to it, maybe putting it in the chat box. But I'd be really interested to know, like having listened to Joe now and some of the conversations we've had, are there any parts of the processes of your organisation or the way that you design services where you might want to go back with your team and think about what those endings look like? So I don't expect anyone to jump on the chat, but maybe just put it in the chat box if you get a second. I'd be really interested. One that strikes me that I just don't see used in the third sector a lot, but there's a couple of good examples of charities doing it, is that end experience and then that prompt to leave a review of that service, which is just like standard practice in the private sector, that as soon as we buy a product or we exit that magazine subscription or whatever it is we're doing, that prompt to leave a review of that service online. And actually in the third sector, we're woefully bad at that. It's like we never ask anyone to review anything. And the classic thing we find is, like, even for some big charities, you Google it and the first thing you find is like 3 1 to 2 star reviews on Google because a couple of disgruntled punters over the course of 5 years left that, and that's what your footprint looks like. And actually, if you look at so really small youth work charity in the East End called Peak, and they've taken a really deliberate step, not just in terms of offboarding people, but in terms of feedback coming in, that when a parent phones office and talks about a good experience their kid had, that person is then prompted to go and leave that review on Facebook reviews and Google reviews. And now when you search for all sorts of youth work services in the East End of Glasgow, they dominate that first page Google, and they dominate it with about 75-star reviews because they built that into their deliberate business processes. I just think for me, it's like, where can you think about those small micro interventions of endings that it doesn't need to be big organizational change? I don't know if you've got any thought on that, Joe, like just like where could someone start in the room, or where could they start that discussion?
I think it starts in the business and talking about where the things end and having an open conversation about that, and starting to frame it beyond the sort of legislative thing into like, how can we use this? What's the type of experience that somebody would expect when you... So one way to look at it is like at the beginning of the consumer life cycle, what components about the end? So if you're talking about food products, then obviously there's a sell-by date. If you're talking about subscription models, then there's a timeout for that over 12 months. Are you going to carry on? So there's all sorts of endings that you're doing right up front. So making sure that type of ending is right. And then in usage, there's other ones, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about endings at the end, but the framing happens throughout, even before you're into sales. And there's I do a whole one about customer satisfaction is higher in companies that talk about endings at the beginning of the consumer life cycle. But if you have a business that says it's easy to leave this business even before you start, that's way more satisfying than a lot of companies.
One quick thing I was wondering about that's maybe an extra difficulty for the voluntary sector is, I think it is probably really insightful to go back to people a bit later and say, you know, you've finished being in contact with us now, what's going on for you? But one challenge is if you're providing support to people in crisis or when they're in a really difficult phase in their lives, once they've finished, they might want to not be connected with your organization again. So if you're in a charity that's supporting people with, maybe it's debt problems, or it could be about addiction services, whatever it might be, you wouldn't necessarily want that organization reaching out again to say, you've not talked to us for a few months, how's it going? So I guess there's maybe like a little bit of kind of thinking needed there, I suppose.
I just noticed Ross, thanks for putting the ends canvas on. So
yeah,
that's actually a very useful tool for you. But
yeah,
it's funny. Just to jump in again, sorry, that I was asked by the collections industry or somebody from that world about ends, and they'd done an interview with me. Super interested about ends because that's their world, and it's so interesting that I'm interested into the collections world and the debt world, but I'm not interested in the banking world. And when you chat to the collections industry, which has changed ever such a lot in the last 20, 30 years, they had a lot more insights into things than banking really desperately needs, and the approach and stuff that they have. It's very eye-opening.
I don't have to know if Martin's left, because I was really interested to know if Martin had any thoughts, because Martin works in ed tech and just where this fits in. I don't know if you've got anything you want to share, Martin, in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, we it's a kind of murky one, and Joe touched on it a bit with like the journey being kind of littered with APIs with certain tools as well. Like with all the kind of ed tech tools I've worked on, like you're integrating with different LMSs and you're integrating with like other systems and rostering systems for class data and stuff like that. So the data is really kind of all over the place. And so the Californian like regulations that came in last year, like when I was at Twig, my last role, we did a lot of work on that and trying to kind of like firm up the processes around it. I don't think like the real problem was that the legacy data and some of the legacy products, like it's just so like murky and so like hard to pick through. It's just like overgrown weeds. So it's like a lot of the people like have technically offboarded a long time ago without realizing that their data is still sitting on there, and schools and districts would have kind of vast accounts of kind of past students on there, but you know nothing's happening with it. It's just sitting there, you know. So
wow.
And they kind of stress it and stuff as well, you know.
This one's a perfect one for Marcus. Did you hear that one, Marcus?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting one, and this is one of those things that I'm really, really interested in exploring deeper in terms of how product life cycles and the data life cycles. I'm beginning to see, this is one of these things that with Joe talking about, you're thinking about writing books and articles, but I'm starting to see that people talk about data and data strategies, that, you know, we're going to acquire more data, we're going to acquire more data. What they don't tend to think about is the service and product life cycles that drive that data acquisition, data acquisition management insights. And that's, I think there's that conversation needs to be had. How do these things, you know, interact with each other? When you start to think about that, you make that strategic decision to offer something different, it's not just the legislation, it is incumbent on you to close all those things down, particularly for personal information. But it's just good commercial sense, because your analogy of a garden is perfect. It's weeds and it's mess and it's literal wasteland that you need to think about. And now as you move to the cloud and the subscription-based model, you know, the lovely people at, Jeff and Satnam and things, they're not going to encourage you to get rid of your software subscriptions at all. You know, you need to start thinking carefully about it, because if not thinking about it is, at the bottom line, it's actually going to cost you and your donors and your shareholders money. It's becoming a commercial decision. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, this is something I'm very interested in exploring. This link. I think it's the correlation between data and product and service life cycles is sort of moving closer to one for all of you statistics fans out there.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you.
No worries.
I'm conscious of time.
Are you feeling under pressure, Ross, to end the call well?
What was that? End the call? I never end the calls well. Do you know? So I was a guest on a podcast the other day, and I ended it by
about 300 times.
And everyone in the podcast had a cat, it turned out. And then somehow I turned it around that cats were amazing, and they were all fools for keeping cats because cats had conned them into feeding them. And so I don't end any of these things very well. So I'm the worst person in the world. On that note, I thought, so Katie's put a wee point in the chat box about Connecting Scotland. So Connecting Scotland, which is Scottish Government and SCDO's flagship digital inclusion programme. I've been doing some work in Wales at the moment, and actually everyone's like, I wish we lived in Scotland. So everyone in the UK is very jealous of the Connecting Scotland programme. I was really pleased to be involved right at the start in a really small way. But I think it's really interesting is like endings and something like that are so critical when you're thinking about how that programme works and giving people a device and giving people data. And the skills are not going to stop being skills that need to be refreshed all the time. And what does an ending look like for something like that? So yeah, I don't know if you've got the answer, Katie, or if you, but it'd be good to know your insights into what that looks like in the planning.
I mean, I don't think that we have the answer yet. And in some ways, we have slightly deferred the ending because we've been able to get more funding to continue people's connectivity for a further 12 months. But what we're really conscious of is that we need to make people aware that there is going to be an ending at the moment, and also give them options and control. So if someone's got a device and hopefully they're using it and hopefully they're finding it valuable, you know, what are their options to continue to use the device in terms of a connectivity solution? How will we help transition those who can afford to pay to be able to afford to pay? So I'm really grateful actually to see the canvas, because our service designer, we've had a bit of discussion. We've also talked about the opportunities that we have when we have the touch points with the customers to get the follow-up feedback from them, which are almost just like, again, it's like the reminders that we want to know what's happening all the way through the service, but also that it will end.
Yeah.
So I think we're just working our way into it just now. I think our earliest, we've probably, we need to settle on it now, because we're like halfway through for some customers, almost halfway through those 2 years.
Oh, by the way, I do a short course online. It's 4 hours. One's tomorrow. I think there's some tickets left for that, but there'll be another one in June. So they're quite regular, and anyone can sign up for them. They're on Eventbrite, and that will teach you all sorts of techniques to how to end things, the process and the tools, and you'll get a lot better deep dive into that. Sort of an introduction to engineering, it's called.
Excellent.
I can share that.
Please do.
Maybe I'll share it on here because we're all in here right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And we can give that a tweet out as well at the end. Joe, we've all been like busy asking questions and looking at chat, so we're not doing a lot of tweeting as we've gone along, but we'll definitely do that. That'd be great. Because I think the thing that I'm taking away from this is like, it sounds so simple, think of how things end, but actually it leads to lots of very interesting questions. So it's been great to hear them.
Yeah, it's been amazing. Yeah, been really useful, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, here you go. So share it around and yeah, cool.
Amazing, thank you. Any final words from you, Joe? Any final part and bits of advice?
Actually, just on that, maybe I can give this. I'll give you a promo code for the next one in June. Maybe it's a bit late for this one, but I'll get in touch with you and maybe you can share it with your audience a later date.
We'd love to do that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Final thoughts from me is thank you so much. And sorry we didn't get to all of the interesting chat stuff as well. Was it Katie? You left 3-4 services the other day. I think that's a really good example of why we need to think about endings. You've been trapped for so long.
Yeah.
It's almost like you get into a mode of it, like, okay, I know this is going to be bad, and then you rattle through them all. So sorry we can't get to that, and thanks for the opportunity to chat to you all today. Very much appreciated.
Thanks, Joe. Just actually on that point, because there was a point there about Rory had made about the kind of ending of tenancies for housing associations. I think one of the things, I mean, that's a kind of external facing service, but when you're starting with this stuff, you might want to think internally as well, because like having been, and like I'm luckily freelance, but having been an employee, like endings for employees are always woeful. Like they're never good experiences. Like, and we almost have this culture of like, we almost deliberately want the endings for people who pushed out the door. Like some companies have built-in policies that like will punt the person away and take away their email address in case something goes wrong. It's like, that's not a nice ending experience for your staff. So for me, that I think that's a really simple one to start with. I don't know what you think, Joe, is like, what does it look like for your own team? And if you can't get that right, how you service users?
Definitely.
Okay. Right, be nice to your staff.
Cool.
That's the lesson. Cool. Thank you so much, Joe.
Great.
Go and buy Joe's book, Ends. Tell us the domain name one final time, Joe.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Kay.
Just screen share, that could be like the end title.
Yeah.
Very good.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Great.
Great.
Cheers,
Thank
Joe.
See you
you.
later. Bye.
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 Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, guys.